Thank you. My name is Sharon Shaughnessy, and I'm just like you, searching for understanding about the standards of Common Core. You know, just as a small child constantly asks why, we should as well ask respectfully why. These are some of the questions I'd ask you to consider. Why did 5 states from the very beginning choose to walk away from Common Core? Why are Indiana, Alabama, South Dakota, Georgia, Michigan, Missouri, Utah, Ohio, and South Carolina pulling away from the standards? Why did the testimonies in Harrisburg have both Democrat and Republican senators skeptical of the standards? Why is it virtually no parents have an understanding of Common Core and were left out of the process? Why did the only mathematician on the validation committee refuse to sign off on the math standards? And why should we blindly accept the unproven, unpiloted standards which are entirely experimental? When did we get so busy that we forgot to ask what? Unfortunately, you might leave tonight with more questions than you came. Our hope is that you leave, you walk away tonight, and decide that this is well worth your time and effort to research. On our quest to find answers, we found an amazing presenter. After listening to her, our guest speaker tonight in Lancaster, we knew instantly that our community needed to hear her. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce her to you. She's a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. She's been an educator for over 35 years, a graduate of Clarion University with the ability to teach mainstream to special education students. She has taught every level from preschool through college. Our speaker has written curriculum, hosted a syndicated program on educational issues. She has served several years as a consultant for the United States Department of Education as a grant reviewer and has been an advisor to President Reagan on education reform for family and single mothers. Presently, she is a chairman of Founded on Truth. May I present Dr. Peg Luksick.
Am I on? No. Do I need to get something back here? Okay, now am I on? Here she comes. Now you hear me? Yes? Just a minute, I have to put my tail back here. I gave a speech one time with a big power pack, and I had my skirt zipped in the back. Do I turn it off? Better? No. All right, what if I just use that? You're used to it. Hang on. I gave a speech once, and I had a back zipper, and they put the power pack on, and when I stood up, it was so strong that it pulled my entire zipper down. And in front of 400 people, I had to say, could you please come and put me back? You don't get embarrassed after that. You just deal with it. As she said, I am a wife. I have 6 children. They are all girls except for 5 of them. It's an IQ joke. How fast did you get it? And in my work, in working with both the Reagan administration and in the years after that, what I have found is that the government consistently has the same agenda, which is to grow. And so it is up to us to stand against that. Now, in the presentation tonight, there's a couple of rules I want you to know. That is more important than me. I'm much prettier than that, but that is more important than I am. So you should turn your attention to that. The documents you are going to see, with one exception, and I will point it out to you, were not written by me. They were written by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, the United States Department of Education, intermediate units. I think that's all. Why do I use those documents? Because what I am going to quote from is the grant applications that Pennsylvania submitted to the U.S. Department of Education. Why am I using those? For the same reason that when you go to a bank for a loan and you say, my income is $100, what does the bank say? Let me see your income tax. Why? Because you might lie to the bank, but you probably didn't lie to the IRS. Well, when Pennsylvania tells you they're doing X, and they tell the federal government that they're doing Y, in a grant application for which they then received money, who do you think they're lying to? Which is why you're going to be seeing the grant applications. You will not, for the most part, be seeing the marketing materials that the Department of Education is putting out to sell Common Core. You're going to see what they told the federal government they either are already doing or are planning to do to implement Common Core. The website, Founded on Truth, if you go there, and it's easy, it's foundedontruth.com, you will find a presentation I gave in Lancaster. There's a button called Common Core, so it's easy to find. You will find a presentation I gave in Lancaster inside that button, and when you scroll down, you'll see, it'll say download. It's the slides that go with the Lancaster presentation. These are slightly different, and if you send me a copy of this presentation, I will do the same thing. I will put the presentation up and the slides so you can download, that way you have them yourself if you want to quote from them, so you don't have to remember everything. If you have a question or a comment for me, please contact me through the website. It takes me right now about 2 weeks because, as you can imagine, I'm sort of drowning in people asking for information. But I get back to everybody, you just need to give me a little bit of time. So the website is foundedontruth.com. There's a button where you can subscribe. You will get weekly blogs and updates, and every time we put something new on, you'll get information about that. Okay, let's begin. Now, there's a tendency to think that this is just, you're Republicans or independents or whatever, and you just don't like the Democrats. In fact, that is not true. The slide that you are seeing is from the U.S. Department of Education. It is dated January 15th, 2009. That is before the current person in the White House took office. So this is neither a Democrat nor a Republican issue. It is not partisan. It was a letter written from the U.S. Department to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, then Secretary Jerry Sahorchak, okay, in which the U.S. Department of Education was congratulating Pennsylvania's standards and assessments for meeting all of the mandatory provisions required for language arts and mathematics. Why would the federal government be telling Pennsylvania that their state assessment system was meeting federal guidelines? And does that matter? So what? So what if the federal government was approving our assessment system? Does that really matter? I'm a boss. You all work for me. I want you all to be at work at 9 o'clock in the morning sharp. But I'm going to show up at 9:30. Are you all going to come to work at 9 o'clock? No, you're going to kind of stroll in anywhere between 9 and 9:30, get your coffee, talk to the water cooler, sit down. You'll kind of sort of be at your desk around 9:30. I'm your boss. I want you all to be at work at 9 o'clock. And at 9:01, I'm standing at the door with a clipboard, marking off the names of anybody who's late. Are you all going to come to work at 9 o'clock? Why? Because I'm assessing you. I'm testing you. If I control the assessment, I control the behavior. And if that assessment matters for graduation, or promotion, or school districts getting money, or teachers getting certified or continuing to move forward, then I control what happens in the classroom. Just like the boss standing at the door. If I control the test, I control what happens. So when the federal government is telling Pennsylvania, your test meets our standards, that doesn't sound like state control to me. The letter goes on and says, go ahead. that the regulations required that states submit an accountability workbook. In other words, not only did we look at your assessments, you had to give us a full workbook telling us all that you are doing in all the areas that we are concerned about. Go ahead. Part of that workbook, they talked about the Longitudinal Data Systems Grant. Pennsylvania put together an information management system. They got $4 million. In the rhetoric that you see, I've now seen it from several school districts and from the state, what they say is there are no new data systems connected to Common Core. The operative word in that sentence is new. This letter was dated in 2009. And Pennsylvania was getting money to improve their longitudinal data system. Now we're going to talk about that data system tonight, but just so you know, it's been around for a while. It's not new for Common Core. They're just using it better. Go ahead. Now, Pennsylvania had to submit their accountability workbook, and here is the table of contents. And in the table of contents, go ahead. One of the principles was tracking student progress. So what did Pennsylvania say? Go ahead. They said that in 2005, there were unique student identifiers in 100 school districts, and by 2007, they would have an ID program for every student in every school district. So is it a new data system? No, it's not new. Does it exist? Oh, you betcha. Go ahead. Pennsylvania received that $4 million to implement. We were a little bit behind in 2007 and 2008, so the Fed stepped in with $4 million to help us come up to speed. Go ahead. It says that they could enable tracking of students across all the school districts. It's interesting when you read the marketing, it says, well, yes, if they admit we have a data system, but all the students are anonymous. And we can track all those anonymous students across school districts in case they happen to move. Really? Without knowing who any of them are. Go ahead. Now, Pennsylvania, when President Obama came in, the federal government, you all heard of the stimulus bill, right? Okay. In the stimulus bill, the federal government appropriated $53.6 billion for what was called the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. That was money that went to the Department of Education, and then they divvied it out through the states. So it was $53.6 billion. Go ahead. Part of that money was Race to the Top, which is what you hear about, but Race to the Top wasn't the biggest piece. In order to get the stabilization money, the states had to say that they were doing certain things. One of them was making progress toward rigorous college and career-ready standards. That word, rigorous, is extremely important. You will never hear anyone from the Department of Education of this state or any state talk about the standards without first saying the word rigorous. If you listen to the Senate education hearings, you heard rigorous college and career ready. You never heard a synonym, but you always heard that word. That is marketing at its finest. Because in the minds of all the listeners, those two words become connected. Rigorous, college and career ready. Later tonight, we're going to look at how the state defines rigorous. But it is a very important word because it's a marketing word. Because we have a natural definition of that word. The other thing they had to do was establish a pre-kindergarten to college and career data systems. So this is not K through 12. The data system starts before your child enters school and follows you through college and into career. It's called a P through 20 system, P, preschool. Then K, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 12. College, 13, 14, 15, 16. 17, 18, 19, 20 is your career. So the data system is not a grade school or high school data system. The states, in order to get this money, had to say that they were establishing a pre-kindergarten all the way through the workforce data system. It's kind of a womb to tomb data system. The government, in order to get the money, the stabilization funds, it came in 2 phases. In other words, the states had to submit an application and say we're going to do X, Y, Z, and Q. And they got a part of the money. And then they had to come back and say, we did X, Y, Z, and Q to get the rest of the money. Why? It's like a leash. You know, don't you say to your children, I'm going to give you money if you wash the dishes. You actually have to wash the dishes to get the money. Well, the states actually had to do the program to get the funding. So they got it in 2 phases. Go ahead. The state had to assure the federal government that they would establish the data system and that they would move toward these standards. After this, the department approved the plan of implementation. You had to give baseline data, then you could get the rest of the money. So first you said, we're going to do this, then you had to say, this is how we're going to do this, this is the timeline that we're going to use to do this, and then after that you could get the rest of the money. Go ahead. Race to the Top was only $4.35 billion of this huge $53 billion application. If you listened to the Senate education hearing, one of the things that the proponents said was, well, Pennsylvania only got $41 million in Race to the Top funds, and that's not enough money to make anybody change the course of an entire state. Right, Race to the Top was only 4.35 of this huge $53 billion appropriation. So how much did Pennsylvania really get? Well, let's look. Go ahead. Now, when you get money from the federal government, they are very nice to you. This is the cover sheet. The U.S. Department of Education puts out a document. It says, you want to apply for federal money? Here's how. Here's the forms. Here's how you fill it out. Here's how you put it together. Now, they do that because it makes it easier for them. Everything looks the same. It's a whole lot easier to read when you have 50 states doing it. So they give you all of the pieces that you need. The first thing they give you is what the application looks like, and part of it, in order to sign it, you have to say, I believe it's true. That's kind of like the sentences that you put on your income tax, right? To the best of my knowledge and belief, all of this is true. So it's right on the signature page that the state has to say, no, I'm not lying. This is Pennsylvania's application. It was signed by Governor Rendell and Jerry Skorchek, who at the time was the Secretary of Education. Now, part of it, remember we talked about the data system. The data system was actually mandated by the America Competes Act. The federal government mandated the data system by federal law, and that's the name of the law. Go ahead. That same America Competes Act mandated that there would be, that all the states would have the standards and assessments. So the federal government in the America Competes Act was telling the states, you have to do this. There's a federal law telling the states you have to do this. Does that make it a federal mandate? Sounds like it to me. Go ahead. This is the Governor Rendell signed saying we were going to comply. This is, you don't need to read it, I'm just showing you that this is the America Competes Act. The federal government gave us a much more easily readable version of this. There are 12 elements to the database. I put it up so you could see, I took it right out of the law, you could see they're all mandated, that's legal language. Go ahead. And that's the rest of it, we'll come back to it in a minute. Each state had to submit baseline data saying, okay, well here's where we are to start in order to do the move towards standards and assessments and the database. Here's where we are to start. And they had to all submit data, and it was, every submission was called Appendix B, because the federal government gives you the outline. Governor Rendell signed it, and here's our Appendix B. Go ahead. No, you're going a little too fast. Okay, so in our Appendix B, there were 4 elements. One was equity and teacher distribution. A lot of the money for the stabilization fund was actually given so that the states would not drop any of their level of education funding. Do you remember during the 2008 presidential campaign, then candidate Obama talked all about how we can't have any teachers lose jobs, we need to keep education funding, we need to keep all the classrooms open. So a big piece of the stabilization fund, he kept that campaign promise, was money was there so that no state would drop its level of funding for education. The federal government was making up the difference. No, go back. The second was the data, the third was the standards, the fourth was supporting struggling schools. The states had to do all 4. They couldn't pick and choose. They couldn't say, well, we'll just pay teachers, or we'll just support struggling schools. They had to do all 4 of those elements to get the money. And they had to submit baseline data telling the feds, here's where we are right now in these 4 areas, and then our plan for how we're going to move forward. Okay, now you can change. The feds actually very nicely told them what were the elements of the data system, just like we talked about in the little America Competes Act. 5 were preschool through grade 12 and post-secondary. 5 were preschool through grade 12. There are actually 12 elements, and you can see they're statutory. They were mandated by the federal government. Go ahead. The state had to say, where are we with moving forward in academic assessments? ESEA, that's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That is the granddaddy funding mechanism for every school from the federal government in the country. And this program is tied to that funding. So it's not just the race to the top. The feds pulled all federal funding together and said, you have to do this. Everything is tied to you doing all of the pieces that we now call Common Core. Go ahead. The states actually, they each got their own letter telling them where they were, and then the federal government actually made a chart so you could see where all the states were. Go ahead. This is the chart. You don't need to read it. You can see green and red and orange. Green means you were approved. Pennsylvania was approved. Yellow means, yeah, you have some things you have to change, state. You're not quite there. And red means bad. You have to do it over. So there was a huge chart, and you could look to see where your state was in the process. But the point was the feds were evaluating every single state and telling them, you're either approved or not approved in terms of data collection. You're either approved or not approved in your assessment system. You're approved or not approved in if you're adopting the standards. This is not a state initiative. Okay? Now, it's hard to change, to like get all that in your head. So the federal government had workshops where they brought the people from the state departments of education in and gave them PowerPoint presentations just like you're seeing tonight. This is one of their PowerPoint presentations. How do we do these rigorous standards? Now, what struck me when I first looked at this was literacy by 3rd grade. My kids could read at the end of 1st. Rigorous standards. Literacy by 3rd grade. What you hear when you talk to the Department of Education is, these are just standards. They don't have anything to do with curriculum. They're just standards. I see effective teaching and learning. If they were just standards, why bother? I'm a 3rd grade teacher. The standard is that every child in my classroom will be able to recite all of their times tables by the end of 3rd grade. If you walk into any 3rd grade classroom, what are you going to see happening? Times tables. Because they can't achieve the standard unless I teach it. A standard that isn't tied to curriculum is a meaningless standard. It has to be tied to curriculum, otherwise the children can't reach it. And how do I know if they reach it? I have to give them a test. So if you walked into my 3rd grade classroom and the standard was every child would be able to recite their times tables, and you saw the kids doing times tables, what would you expect my math test to have in it? Times tables. Because if it didn't, how would I know they met the standard? So if I control the standard and the assessment, I control everything else. Go ahead. And here they talk about standards and assessment, aligned instruction, just like we just said. When the state says this has nothing to do with classroom, that's just silly. Anybody who knows anything about education realizes that that is not an accurate statement. And the federal government told them quite clearly, you must align the instruction to the standards. How do we know you did it? Well, the data systems will tell us. That's how we know which kids did it and which kids didn't. The stabilization fund, there were 2 phases. The first phase was the biggest. The second phase was smaller. Go ahead. After the stabilization fund, the last piece of it were all of these other little grants. Race to the top, school improvement, education technology, investing in innovation, teacher incentive, statewide longitudinal data systems. They were all included in this big, huge $53 billion hunk. In the 2 phases, the governors had to sign assurances saying they were doing it. First phase was the biggest. There's the 4 pieces we talked about. How did that work? You start by reviewing your existing, what you have in the state to begin with. You revise to match what the feds are telling you you have to. And you see in the middle, there's the Title I, that's the ESEA funds. So all federal funds are tied together. Well, how do we know that you are, in fact, State Department of Education compliant? That's why we need the data system. And then phase 2 tells us you've moved forward. You could only get Race to the Top funds if you had completed the stabilization fund, phase 1 and phase 2. Well, what is that data system? The Fed said that the goal was to improve instruction, to know if graduates have skills, to simplify reporting and support decision making. They wanted to evaluate programs and develop signs. Post-secondary, remember we talked about P through 20. In 2009, Pennsylvania was already integrating post-secondary data into the data system. Some states were already integrating workforce data. At the time this presentation was given at the federal level, Pennsylvania had not yet begun that. They have since corrected the problem. What are the next steps? Well, we need connections to early childhood, post-secondary, labor. We need to connect teachers and students. We need to give access to researchers and public stakeholders. There used to be, there still is, it's a federal law, it's called the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. It used to protect pupil privacy. This administration rewrote the regulations to say that anyone with a, quote, legitimate educational interest in the information can have access to the data. That includes vendors, people who want to sell to the schools. There's been a lot of talk, and if you looked at the education hearings, about why Bill Gates is funding this. And this is a computerized system, and Bill Gates owned Microsoft. Why wouldn't he fund it? And access to the data. Go ahead. What are the elements? Remember, I told you the feds gave us a much better picture. Student enrollment information, information on graduates and transfers and dropouts, state assessment scores, information on students not tested. I opted my child out of the state assessment. It doesn't matter, we're going to get information anyway. And on the grades when the assessment doesn't happen, we're still going to get that information. College readiness, a teacher identifier system. So not only is there a unique number for every child, there is a unique number for every teacher. Why? I was talking to a member of the State House, and he said, good teachers just won't teach this. They'll say, well, this is silly. And they'll close the door of the classroom and they will do what they want. That will not happen this time, because every teacher has a number 2. So teacher number 12, Mrs. Blankenschmiel in the Outer Podunk School District, isn't teaching it, therefore her students are not passing the assessments. We can connect those students to that teacher and go back and say, you're not teaching this. And teacher tenure and certification and continued hiring and bonuses are all tied to this. That's why they need to identify the teachers, because the teachers tend not to comply with silliness, especially ones who had a lot of years of experience. They're like, oh, somebody else is getting their master's degree. Okay, they close their door and do what they know works. But a teacher identifier system means that now we can find those teachers. Student transcript information, data on your success in college, data on preparation, an audit system. We're going to make sure all the data is accurate, it's up to date, everything's in there that's supposed to be in there. An ability to share data from preschool through college, and unique student identifiers. Those are the 12 elements that are mandated by the American Competes Act. They must be in the state data system, and in fact they are in our state data system. P through 20 program, that's what we talked about. And early education moves all the way down into labor. Notice at the bottom, that little block that says health. So it's a complete package of data. It's not just how you did in school. It's a complete package of data that follows you, P through 20. How do we move forward? Well, remember those standards and assessments? And there you see the common standards. So the tendency is this doesn't have anything to do with Common Core. It's right there. You notice the 21st century technology, computer-based testing. What does that mean? That means that the children will be based, the testing information will come through a computer. I'm a telemarketer. We've all got calls from telemarketers. I sell purple shoes. I love purple. So I'm going to call you tonight. And I'm going to say, do you like shoes? And you're going to say yes or no. And I'm going to say, do you like purple? And you're going to say yes or no. Do you buy your own shoes? Do you buy all the shoes for your family? That's called a pre-test. I'm finding something out about you so I know what to say in the telemarketing call. You have answered my questions. Now I'm going to tell you all about the wonders of purple shoes. That's the curriculum. I'm teaching you something. When I'm done, I'm going to say, should I put that on your Visa or your MasterCard? That's the post-test, the assessment. If you say Visa or MasterCard, congratulations. You have met my goal, and you may graduate from this conversation. But if you say no, I'm going to say, what is your objection? And you're going to tell me. And then I'm going to say, well, that shouldn't be an objection. And I'm going to answer it. That's remediation. You didn't pass. You flunked the test because you didn't put it on your Visa or your MasterCard. So I must remediate you. And when I'm done remediating you, I'm going to say, so should I put that on your Visa or your MasterCard? That is a re-assessment. I'm testing you again. And if you put it on your Visa or MasterCard, I say, congratulations, you can graduate from this conversation. Most of us give telemarketers twice around that circle because we're polite. And then we say, that's enough. You should move on to somebody who might actually buy your shoes. But if that cycle is run by a computer in a classroom, a child can't hang up the phone. They will walk that circle again and again and again until they meet the outcome. Computer-based assessment means you will comply. Because the computer doesn't care if you have to do it 25 times. It'll just keep circling you around. Go ahead. So, number 41 million wasn't enough to change states' behaviors, so what are we worried about? Pennsylvania got $1.9 billion in the state fiscal stabilization fund before it could even start the race to the top process. It had to say it was doing these things, it had to prove to the federal government it was doing it, and in return they received $1.9 billion. Even Tip O'Neill would think that that was real money. Go ahead. Now, race to the top was the next piece. The federal government, when they give a grant, not only do they give you the form, they give you what's called frequently asked questions. You all see the FAQs. Well, they make a whole document because they don't want to answer the phone 50 times with the same question, so they give it to you in writing. What were the questions? Well, what are the eligibility requirements? You had to have your Phase 1 and Phase 2 stabilization fund money approved before you could even submit a race to the top grant application. So you already had to have complied with starting to do your assessments. You had to have complied with the data system before you could even put a race to the top grant application in to the federal government. Go ahead. How does it interact? Well, the feds say that the stabilization program that we've been talking about, Race to the Top, and the other federal programs designed coming through this stimulus bill all work together. So that we take the federal money in a big pile and we push it together to get this all done. Go ahead. The state had to say that they were going to adopt their Common Core standards by August the 2nd of 2010. And in the application for Race to the Top, they got points in order to, if they met that standard. So not only did they have to adopt the Common Core standards, they had to adopt them by August the 2nd of 2010. There was a deadline. They had to, not only did they have to say they were going to adopt them, they had to tell the federal government, here's our plan. Here's how we're going to make sure that we've met your deadline. The feds did not leave a whole lot to chance in this picture. They made sure that every step of the way, the state had to either prove they were already complying or submit a plan to say how are they going to comply by the deadline. Well, how did all this money fit together? Well, in the federal document, they say that the states are supposed to describe how they're moving all federal money together in order to implement this. Why? Because it's expensive. And we'll, in a few minutes, hear how much Pennsylvania told Washington it would cost to do this. But they were actually told, in your budget of this grant, tell us how much you're going to spend and how you're going to find the money. Where are you going to get it from? Pennsylvania's Race to the Top application. Remember the first one that said, I believe it's all true? This one had that sentence, but it had a second sentence. I certify that I've read this, that I'm committed to it, and I will do it. So that was a higher standard than, it's true. It's like, no, I've read this. Now, do I actually believe the governor read it? Well, the Phase 2 application, which is the one you're looking at here, the application was a little over 300 pages long, and the appendices were almost 1,000 pages. So, do I think the governor actually read every word? Probably not. Do I think the Department of Education did? Yes. And somebody in the governor's office, I'm sure, did. Regardless, they had to say they read it. Why do you have to say that? Have you been watching the IRS hearings? I don't know. I don't remember. I'm not responsible for that. They fixed that in this grant application. I read it. I'm committed to it. So they can't ever say they didn't know, because they had to sign that they read it and that they were going to do it. It begins with definitions. The definition of the Common Core standard said it was standards that were basically identical across all the states, and you could have 15% additional standards. You could not subtract. You could not edit. You could add a little bit. Why? Because Pennsylvania and every other state has, the student will learn U.S. history and fill in the name of the state, history. Some states have some agricultural standards. Some states have health care, in health, like AIDS or smoking, that have been mandated by the legislature in that state and are specific to that state, and so they can't be moved. So they were given room to include those as long as they had all of the Common Core standards. They couldn't subtract them. They couldn't edit them. They could just add a little bit. Go ahead. The Pennsylvania Board, this is what Pennsylvania is telling the federal government, is going to adopt the standards by August the 2nd. And because Pennsylvania requires all LEAs, local education agency, that's your school district or a charter school, to adhere to the state standards, everybody will teach according to the Common Core. So if the state board does it, every school district in the state is roped to it. Notice it doesn't say, we'll just have standards. It will say, we'll teach to the Common Core. Is this going to affect classrooms? Yes. Go ahead. How are they going to make sure? Pennsylvania has what's called a standards-aligned system portal. It's a website. Teachers can access it. You get a unique identifier, to access it. And it contains the standards. It drills down so that the standards are then moved into classroom content. There's assessments that go with it. And that's how they'll know that the teachers are, in fact, compliant, because they can track who accessed the standards-aligned system portal, where the curriculum exists. Now, you notice it's an interactive website that allows teachers and leaders. Who's missing? Parents. You don't have the number. When one of my little ones was in, well, now they're big ones, but when they were little, was in kindergarten, I called the school and said, I want to see the books. And I went down and got all of the books. Because that's what you do when you want to know, what are you teaching? Send a book home. I want to see the book. How do they send the computer website home? You don't have a number, and how would you know you saw it all? And what if you're a parent that doesn't have a computer at home? Notice you're missing. Go ahead. Pennsylvania, in their grant, in Appendix B7, actually gave, remember they had to say, what is our plan for adopting? So they said, well, we're going to be adopting them well in line with the August 2nd target. Originally, Pennsylvania said, well, if we receive them by March, we can make it by August. But they didn't receive them. So in the second phase, they said, well, if we receive them by June, we'll still be able to make it by August. No, not yet. What you hear from the state is, this is a state initiated. The state board did this. This is a state process. I have written 6 books. I didn't receive the books I wrote from anybody. I have read many books. I received them from a library, a friend, the bookstore. I didn't write what I received. If they were waiting to receive the books, the Common Core standards, how could they have written them? Because if you wrote them, you didn't have to receive them. And why did they have to wait for something that they wrote? Go ahead. In their timeline, they said they would receive them by June the 2nd, and then they would run through this. So June the 2nd, June 30th, we're like 28 days later. Go ahead. And on July 1st, they'll vote to adopt them. So they told the federal government, as long as we receive them by June, we'll be able to adopt them 30 days later. But Pennsylvania says when regulations are changed, there's supposed to be public input, and there's supposed to be a response to that. So it's a participatory process. But this says, we're going to receive them, and not even 30 days later, we're going to adopt them. Isn't that kind of like, I'll give you a fair trial before I hang you? Because it's a fair foregone conclusion. They told the feds they were going to adopt these standards before they saw them. They hadn't received them yet, and they were promising to adopt them. Lots. Go back. Okay, one more. Okay, now each school district, remember they talked about all the school districts would have to participate. Some school districts were going to get more money, so they were going to be the frontline districts. 122 actually said, we will do this sort of on the front wave. And they had to sign what was called a Memorandum of Understanding. Go ahead. No, go back. Okay, the memorandum does not have an opt-out clause. The feds said, if school districts are going to do this, we need to know that they're really going to do this. So Pennsylvania's response was to say, well, there's no opt-out clause. So once a school district signs in, they can't get out. Now, I was talking about this in another part of the state, and that person went to their local state rep and said, there's no opt-out clause, and the state rep said, oh no, that would be illegal. Illegal and impossible are not synonyms. And in fact, that's what the grant says. Go ahead. What did the districts have to agree to do? They had to agree to implement curriculum that was aligned with the standards and the assessments all the way down the line. There was no separation between the standards and the tests and the curriculum. They also had to say that they were going to make the data available to researchers in our longitudinal data system. So your kids are like guinea pigs. Go ahead. Now, Pennsylvania has put out a document. Some of you may have seen it. It's their fact sheet. And in their fact sheet, and we're not going to go through the whole thing, but just to give you an example, they say, and the bottom line is bigger, in Pennsylvania, the curriculum and other classroom tools are determined solely by the local school districts and their personnel. They handed that out to every member of the State House, every member of the State Senate, and in testimony, that was what the Department of Education representatives stated. The curriculum is solely controlled at the local level. What did they say to the federal government? In March of 2010, Pennsylvania, in one of its Race to the Top applications, was selected as a finalist. Race to the Top was a competition. The states all applied and only some of them got the money. If you were a finalist, you went to Washington and you sat before a review board put together by the Federal Department of Education. And in that review board, they asked you questions about your grant. And that's how they determined who actually won. So the Pennsylvania representative said, she talked about how many districts were involved, and then she said, the second thing is that our statewide reforms are going to affect every school district, not just participating districts. Our student-level data system, available to everybody. Our SAS, that's Standards Aligned System portal, updated for Common Core, available to everybody. And one of the federal panelists interrupted her and said, now, for clarification, when you use that term available, does that mean required or just available? And she said, for non-participating school districts, the SAS portal, which is our standards and our curriculum, that's available to school districts, but everybody has to teach to our standards. That's required. And everybody has to implement our high school end-of-course exams. That's required. So in order for them to successfully get to their high school exams, which will be aligned to the Common Core, they're going to need to access all that stuff. Our experience is that when we have made mandatory things available, pretty much everybody is using them. But curriculum is solely determined at the local level. But that's not what they told Washington. Go ahead. In the grant, they talked about this, that we have to prepare teachers to teach the Common Core. They're also putting together summative and formative assessments. What does that mean? A summative assessment, that's your final exam. My husband is a high school teacher today, which was his birthday, and he got to celebrate by giving final exams to his high school students. They weren't thrilled. They would have rather had a cupcake. But that's a summative assessment. It's the sum of everything you've learned all year, or if it's a semester course, all semester. Formative assessments. That's your weekly spelling test. So all along the way through the year, I'm checking and checking and checking. It's all the little tests, the chapter test, the unit test, the pre-test, all the little tests that the teachers give in the classroom through the year to make sure that little Susie is actually doing and keeping up and doing all the things that she is supposed to be doing. So in the Common Core, the standards, the end-of-course exams, and all the little tests along the way are aligned to Common Core. So you can't ignore it and then just teach to the test at the end of the year, because all the tests along the way throughout the year are part of this system. They built it so there's no escape clause. Go ahead. This is, I think, one of the most cynical statements, and I've seen a lot of things in the government that I've ever heard a government say. Every school district in the state must update its instructional program to reflect the new standards, and they must use the new mandated assessments. We anticipate that given the limited resources most districts have for curriculum improvements, the overwhelming majority will rely on the SAS portal to bring their program in line. In other words, every district, you have to change your curriculum. We know you all have budget problems. There's a number of issues confronting every school district in this state. You can't afford to change your curriculum. Here, we'll give it to you. Go ahead. The screening assessments, Pennsylvania is putting their computer adaptive assessments. So remember we talked about our little salesman process. These are assessments that are designed to diagnose the student's strengths and weaknesses and skills and knowledge. Is little Johnny complying? Why not? What do we need to know about little Johnny to make sure that he complies? Strengths and weaknesses. So it's a computer assessment system that is aimed at each child in order to figure out why he's not complying and then to bring him into compliance. Go ahead. The local school districts will be held accountable for their progress. So a local school district, remember they can't opt out, even if they didn't say they would participate, they still have to teach it. And now they're held accountable, and if they don't produce, the state can intervene. So the state can step into your school district if you are not making progress toward the standards. So the state is going to put together a budget. Remember we talked about all the money together? And Pennsylvania said, well, we're going to do that. We're going to coordinate funding. We're going to reallocate funding. We're going to repurpose funding from other federal sources. If I'm reallocating, it means it came from point A to point B. What was point A? What is losing money in order to make the money available for this? And how much does this cost? This part of it always reminds me of the 12 Days of Christmas when I tell it to you. It kind of sounds like the song goes on forever, never, never. Pennsylvania told the federal government they needed to have a project director, a program director for teacher quality, a program director for SAS and data. Go ahead. 2 more program directors, one for the charter schools, one for a turnaround office, that's struggling schools. Go ahead. 21 management staff. Go ahead. They're going to put together a consortium of resident scholars. We don't know how many of those there are. Go ahead. They're going to hire 220 additional technical experts to help implement this throughout the state. And then they're going to have additional external service providers. That's an awful lot of people, isn't it? Go ahead. So how much did they say it's going to cost? Well, they said they needed $400 million from the race to the top. Go ahead. They said they needed $140 million in school improvement funds, and they would combine that with $2.6 billion in state monies to the districts through the school adequacy formula. In other words, reallocating and repurposing money. And those 3 things together are what Pennsylvania said would be necessary and sufficient to do Common Core. So $400 million and $140 million and $2.6 billion. That's $3.14 billion to implement Common Core. In some testimony, there are some folks that say, well, it was estimated it'll be $600 million, and the proponent said, no, it won't be that much money. I'm not sure where the $600 million came from. Pennsylvania told Washington in their grant application that you remember the governor said was true, he read, he was committed to, he was going to implement, that it would take $3.14 billion to do this program. Go ahead. The districts have to say how they're going to, on top of all of that, the districts have to say, how are they going to fund the additional costs? Because there's more costs, there's more services, there's signing bonuses in order, because remember, equal distribution of teachers across all these districts. So we have to give signing bonuses. If they don't comply, we have to do additional services. So on top of that money from the state, the districts have to say, where are they going to get the additional money as well? Go ahead. Remember I said this isn't Democrat or Republican? The application you're looking at was signed by Governor Rendell. The Phase 3 application was signed by Governor Tom Corbett. When this was put together, we were in the middle of a governor's race, and the application says both the Democrat candidate and the Republican candidate for governor signed off on Common Core. Political sustainability, it didn't matter which party won. Go ahead. Pennsylvania is doing the summative assessments. What I want you to look at is they're going to do end-of-course exams in English, math, science, and history And they will all be based on Common Core. But Common Core is only math and English. How can you have English, math, science, and history based on Common Core standards that are only math and English? Unless, of course, there are history and science standards that we just haven't seen yet. Because you can't base assessments on non-existent standards. They're saying they're going to base assessments on Common Core standards in all 4 areas. Go ahead. Here's our data system. Over the last 5 years, unique identifiers for students and teachers. Was it new? No, they've been working on it for 5 years. Now, I am a teacher, so I got myself invited to one of the training sessions that the IU is conducting on how to implement Common Core in Pennsylvania, and they handed out flyers. Now, it was a PowerPoint that we had a paper copy of, so I took the paper copy home, scanned it back into the computer so the quality's not the greatest. Go ahead. Now, do you remember that word rigor? Rigorous standards. Go ahead. Rigor is approaching math with a disposition to accept, challenge, and apply effort. Go ahead. Rigor is not difficult, like AP Calculus is difficult. So if I walked into a math class with a bunch of pickup sticks and I dropped them on the floor and said, go collect them all and count them, that's rigorous, right? Because you'd have to apply effort. Did you learn anything? Not unless you couldn't count. In one of the presentations, the presenter talked about rigorous standards in chemistry, and she said that she had her high school chemistry students build little models using little balls of atoms, you know, green and red and blue, I mean this colors up, but you get of the parts of the atom and little sticks, for all the atoms in the periodic table. And she said, and the brightest students had a lot of trouble with that. They just couldn't seem to deal with that rigorous content. Okay, so while you're building little models of atoms in high school, you're not learning Avogadro's number or Ohm's law or balancing equations. No wonder the brightest students were frustrated. They didn't need to build little models. They wanted to learn chemistry, and instead they built little models. That was rigorous. Go ahead. So, these rigorous math standards, this is the assessments that will be given in the state of Pennsylvania for high school. The math assessment is Algebra 1. That's all. And when asked about it, the answer was, well, remember, it was college and career ready. And if you're going into a service career, you don't need any more than Algebra 1. In the Senate Education hearing, that came up. And the same answer was given by the gentleman from the business community. Well, you know, people are going into manufacturing jobs or the military, they don't need any more math than that. And we need, the military has a stake in this, and business has a stake in this, so that's really all they need. So, do you really think that Bryn Mawr in Philadelphia or Fox Chapel in Pittsburgh is going to stop with Algebra 1? No, those districts won't stop there. But inner city Philadelphia, and inner city Pittsburgh, and inner city Harrisburg, this says they have to have a 93% graduation rate. And if you only have to have Algebra 1 to graduate, and the school is struggling to get kids to Algebra 1, is it going to go past there? In the Senate Education hearing, one of the proponents of this said, well, you know, this is the floor. Okay, it's a really low floor. And high school wasn't supposed to be about aiming our children at the floor. It was supposed to be about aiming our children at the ceiling. And then helping them get as close as they could to reaching it. Who decides who gets Algebra 1 and who gets nothing more? And who is the client of the education system? Is it really industry? Or was it parents and students? I think this is one of the saddest things I've ever seen. Years ago, I fought another federal encroachment into the education system called outcome-based education. And in that debate, It was Algebra 1 and Geometry, because those are the gateway maths. You're not even required to have geometry in this system. You will have what you need to do the job. That's all. You notice biology, civics, and government. Remember, we only had math and English standards. How do we have a biology test if there's no science standards? Moving on. I know this is hard to read. This is the language arts. And what they're saying is we don't want it to be difficult. We want it to be depth of knowledge. So the old way, you read a story, and in the story is a baker, and the question said, the baker is most likely behaves as he does because he lacks talent or popularity or success or generosity. That's the old way. We don't want to do that. The new way, which is depth of knowledge, and it's hard to read, is which of the following sentences shows us that the baker lacked generosity, and then there's 4 sentences. And she said, see, that shows more depth of knowledge. And I wasn't really going to talk in this presentation I went to, but I just couldn't. My husband says you can always tell an Irish girl, but you can't tell her much. And I was certainly that way that day. And I raised my hand and I said, wait, no. The first one shows more depth of knowledge because you have to read the story, you have to look at the baker's behavior, you have to think about it, and then draw a conclusion. In the second one, you don't even have to read the story. They give you 4 sentences. Pick one. You don't even have to read the story. How's that depth of knowledge about what you're reading? Go ahead. Now, part of Common Core, and you may have heard this if you've read anything, is we're going to balance literary and informational texts. So by the 12th grade, they will only read 30% literature, they will read 70% informational text. It could be a government document, it could be a training manual, it could be a cookbook, informational. Only 30% is literature. Why does that matter? Because literature reaches beyond your mind. Let me give you an example. I had a friend, actually he wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong. He taught at Boston College. And kids would come into his classroom, and they had all had the lifeboat exercise. Remember, there's, 10 people in the boat, you can only have 9. Who are you going to throw out of the boat? That was the lifeboat exercise. And then you would have to justify your choice. And you would get the demographic for each of those people, and you would have to justify who you would throw out of the boat. Now, I got that when I was in grad school, and I said, we'll throw a rope out of the back of the boat. Somebody will swim for an hour in shifts. There's only ever 9 people in the boat. We're good to go. The professor said, there's sharks in the water. I said, there's a shark back in the boat. It's pretend. If you can make up a shark, I can make up a bag. This is stupid. And when I said that, the whole rest of the class went, okay, everybody's going to take off their clothes because one of the 10 people in that story was a baby, and the weight of wet clothes from 9 adults is the weight of 1 baby. So we can keep 10 people in the boat. We can turn the boat upside down, put the baby on the top, we all cling to the boat. They came up with tons of solutions because I changed the task. Because our minds are like computers, we do the job in front of us. Now, interestingly, I have a son who just graduated from college. He had a job interview today. He's an engineer. Came out of the interview and said, in the job interview, his prospective boss said, so there's you and your best friend and an old lady and a girl, and you're in the desert, but you have a car that only seats 2 people. Which 2 will you leave behind? In a job interview. And my kid said, nobody. We'll just drive the car really slowly, and everybody will take turns jumping in and out of the car. Well, you can't give that answer. You can only have 2 people in. He said, okay, we'll put the old lady and the girl in the car because I'm 22 and I'm in great shape because he's a cross-country runner, and so is my best friend. So we could probably run out of the desert. We're good. We have a better chance. Somebody's going to die. I was like, what does this mean? He's just fixated with death? That's a lifeboat story. So my friend has all these kids come into his college classroom. They've had the informational text, the lifeboat story, and they sit there and discuss their choices. And then he shows them the old Titanic movie, A Night to Remember. It had Barbra Streisand and Clifton Webb in it. And the front of the movie is the fiction, because it's a love story and whatever. But then the iceberg hits the boat, and one of the men, and it's the lifeboat story, because you have more people than you have lifeboats. So it's the story come to life. And one of the men dresses up like a woman and tries to sneak onto the lifeboat. And he gets caught. They find him, and they drag him off the boat. And he says, but I own a business, and I'm a very important person, and I have much more to live for than that person and that person and that person, and so I deserve to be in the lifeboat. Isn't that just what the students did in the lifeboat exercise? Except he's a coward. And you look at him with contempt, and everybody did. And then there's the English dame who's like 70, and she's been married forever, and she's an English dame. She has a seat in the lifeboat, and she sees a young woman with a child, a baby, and the woman is like steerage. And the dame gets out of the boat and gives her seat to this young woman, and then takes her coat off and gives it to her too to keep the baby warm, and says, I've lived with my husband for 60 years. I've had a wonderful life. I'm giving her my seat. And the crew members say, you can't give your seat to her. And of course she's a dame, and so they're not, that's my seat, young man. I will give it to whom I like. And they pipe down, and she does. That's courage and compassion. See, informational texts don't touch your heart. Literature does. In every survey ever done, it was funny, the engineer, he was being smarty, and he said, Mom, there's a survey, who's the greatest hero that was ever in the movies? And I looked at him and said, oh, Atticus Finch. And he went, that's right. And I asked his sister, and she said Atticus Finch. Right. And I asked my brother, and he said Atticus Finch. Right. Because he's the greatest hero. And in every survey ever done, if you've ever read To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch is a hero. Period. But in an informational text, he wouldn't show up that way. When I taught high school history, I taught it with literature first. The Russian Revolution makes much more sense if you read Crime and Punishment, because you understand why it was so vicious and violent, when you feel the desperation of the people. Culture comes through literature. That's how we enculturate our children. We're denying that to them. Go ahead. Now, in this system, everything is going to say, it's a text-based answer. In the presentation, what you heard is, we're referring them back to the text. We're referring them back to the text. We're referring them back to the text. So your answers can only come from the text that I give you. It's informational text. Anything that you say, you have to base your answer on the text that I give you, and you can't say anything else. That your answer has to come from the text. Go ahead. Now, this is the part that I wrote. I actually wrote a book on A Parent's Guide to Reading Instruction, how to pick a reading program. It's on the internet. This is his little story. The candidate, a stick of a woman, sat rigidly in her chair as she addressed the press conference. When asked about her position on the environment, she tersely outlined her program. She lectured the reporters on the changes she would make to education and the tax code. When questions about foreign policy came up, she grimly explained how she would address the situation. At the end of the conference, she stood silently and left the room. Do you like this lady? Now, she's kind of unpleasant, isn't she? Not a very nice lady. Kind of witchy looking, very grim. Not nice at all. Next. Now look at the other side. The candidate, a petite woman, sat confidently in her chair as she addressed the press conference. When asked about a position on the environment, she briefly outlined her program. She carefully listed the changes she would make to education and the tax code for the reporters. When questions about foreign policy came up, she said the situation was serious and explained how she would address it. At the end of the conference, she smiled quietly before she left the room. Isn't that the same story? Do you like that woman? If I control the text, I control everything. Go ahead. So, this is the new GED programs. They're Common Core compliant. This is from the Washington Times. The publisher is called New Readers Press. The GED program is often, the GED test is used by homeschoolers a lot, because that's how they get their high school diploma. This is the largest publisher of GED programs, and they have now made all of their stuff Common Core compliant. So the text, you get a text and then you have to, it's test prep. So we give you the text and then how the test fits together. You're judged based on if you can generate an argument based on the text. So the text, you read the text, you answer the question, and your answer must go back to the text. And if you can generate an argument based on the text, then you get points. So what does the text say? Well, the text on global warming says global temperatures are increasing because of the use of fossil fuels and deforestation, attributing global warming to human industrial activity and population growth. Is that a political statement or a science statement? It's a political statement. But if I control the text, if a child doesn't accept the political statement, he won't score as well with the GED test because he has to build his answer on the text. Go ahead. This is Florida Virtual School. It was also in the Washington Times. And in this, it's called the Florida Virtual Online Class. It was world history. It said Bible passages could be used to justify the slaughter of men. They drew parallels between Christianity and Islam in that fundamentalists from both religions could use scripture to descend into violence, and states that common traits that psychologists have found in terrorists is that they are risk takers and suffer from low self-esteem. There was an outcry, and the school officials said they couldn't change the course because it was in line with Common Core standards and not something the teacher can alter or change. Is that education or politics? Politics. Go ahead. The National Governors Association is actually the organization that is putting these Common Core statements together. They, go to the next one. The standards are going to be aligned with work expectations. There's that word rigorous again. Go ahead. Where did the standards come from? Because remember, the state received them. So they had received them from somebody. They received them from the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. That's a lot of words. In the Senate Education hearing, there was a big discussion about, isn't the National Governors Association just like there's a council of township supervisors, and there's a group of the county commissioners in the state. So this is just a group of governors who came together. No, it's not. It's the Center for Best Practices, which is a separate organization that files a separate 990, which is a nonprofit organization like the Red Cross or Goodwill. They file a separate tax return. They have a separate board of governors. They are a private organization, and they have received millions of dollars in grants from the federal government, the Gates Foundation, and the National Governors Association itself to build these standards. Go ahead. Every state has 3 years from the time they adopt the standards to align everything that they're doing. These standards were adopted in 2010. This is 2013. 3 years. We're at the end. They're going to be beginning now. Go ahead. Skip that. Go ahead. Okay, so here's the website for the Common Core standards. Well, the website says that the standards are the property of the Center for Best Practices, and they retain all the rights to them. Go ahead. It says that they have the right to refuse any person access to this site. So if you're a parent, how can you be refused access to something that affects your children? It says that you get a license to be allowed to use the standards, but they're copyrighted to this organization. It says they have to be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the standards unless the standards have been adopted for a state. And then the state doesn't have to tell anybody that the standards are owned by this group. Everybody else has to say, no, they're copyrighted. They're the sole owners and developers of the standards. Except if you're the State Department of Education, and then you don't have to tell your people that the standards are owned by somebody else.
That's un-American.
Go ahead. No, go back one. Anybody else has to list them as the authors and the publishers of the standards, except for the states. Go ahead. Now, we've talked about the data system, we've talked about aligning everything. 13 academic areas. I was very struck by that. Math and English, but everything's aligned in 13 academic areas. Those 13 areas have not yet been defined. Go ahead. Post-secondary institutions are going to revise their programs. In other words, the state's going to go to the colleges and say, you need to change what you're doing so that what you're doing connects to the Common Core standards. And if necessary, the state will mandate those changes. Well, if the high school graduation standard is Algebra 1, what does that mean the colleges have to do? Not yet defined. The state will revise the content on the state test to attach to every standard. The state will build the Keystone assessments so that they match the Common Core standards, and then they will go to the colleges to have those assessments be the placement exams for colleges. So we connect all the way through. Go ahead. By 2013, that's now, we'll have the ability to track students from birth to the workforce. Go ahead. We're one of the only states with an integrated early childhood to post-secondary data system. Remember at the beginning we were behind, but by now, we're good to go. Now, do you remember those 12 areas that we talked about? Pennsylvania went through each of the 12 areas. I want you to look at the middle column. Area 1, Met. Go ahead. Met, Met, Met. Met, 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 Met. Met, and Met. We met all 12. Those data elements that were in that first chart, we told the feds we've done them all. So we have all the identifiers for students, identifiers for teachers. We can track from preschool through work. Now we want to expand. We got $14 million in late 2010 so that we can connect to workforce data. And we can connect data not just on the little kids, but on the teachers of little kids, early childhood educators, so that we can collect data on the people who are running our preschools to make sure they're complying as well. And we got $14 million to do that. Now, is it really political, or did I just give you weird examples? The U.S. Secretary of Education went to the Sustainability Summit in 2010, and he said, through Race to the Top, we've unleashed an avalanche of reform. Go ahead. He said this summit represents the first time that the department is taking a leadership role in educating the next generation of green citizens. Go ahead. He said, a well-educated citizen knows we must not act in this generation in ways that endanger the next. Educators will teach students about how the climate is changing. They will explain the science behind climate change. They have a role in preparing students for jobs in the green economy. Go ahead. I promise you will be a committed partner in the national effort to build a more environmentally literate and responsible society. Go ahead. We are energized at joining these Sustainability Summit leaders in preparing students to participate in the green economy and to be well educated about the science of sustainability. We must advance the sustainability movement through education. As an initiative, we gave grants to 5 states to develop career pathways to support the green economy. In other words, we're going to take kids out, start putting them into shadowing so they can we start moving them into jobs that are green jobs. Education Week had a big article about it, and they said, now, these are pathways. These are not tracks. Go ahead. Our commitment has to be more than green pathways. It has to prepare them with the knowledge they need to be green citizens. Go ahead. We want all students to have a well-rounded, well-class curriculum, and that curriculum should include environmental literacy. Go ahead. Right now, preparing our students to be good environmental citizens is some of the most important work any of us can do. Now, whether or not you agree with him, how could the federal government have any ability to do this if they weren't involved in education at the classroom level? Go ahead. Education and sustainability are the keys to our economic future. So how are they going to get there? Go ahead. Remember the Council of Chief State School Officers, they own Common Core with the Governor's Group. This is their new, February 2013, knowledge, skills, and dispositions, because we want them to be college, career, and citizenship ready. Go ahead. The Common Core standards are foundational, but they're not sufficient. Dispositions, behaviors, capacities, habits, and mind. We need to figure out how to get those. Well, what are dispositions? Go ahead. They are self-efficiency, initiative, resilience, adaptability, leadership, ethical behavior, and civic responsibility. And the federal government's going to teach that, mind you. Social awareness and empathy and self-control. Do you really want the federal government defining those things? I certainly don't. Go ahead. We need to make sure for college, career, and citizenship readiness that this moves down to the state, so the state makes that the goal of their educational system. How do they do that? Well, we need to redesign support services so that every child is internalized. This instruction will be, like every child will internalize this instruction from the earliest time forward. How do we do that? We have to be able to track and support each student's individual learning progression. So it's individualized instruction, go ahead, which is like an IEP for every child through an online system. Remember that computer that you can't hang up the phone? Go ahead. We have to change our assessments so that they combine knowledge, skills, and dispositions. They have to go beyond the Common Core so that we know that they not just learn what we want them to learn, but they think how we want them to think. They believe what we want them to believe. Dispositions. Who's that? That's my granddaughter. Isn't she adorable? Now, remember that all girls except for 5? And my son and his wife had the very good taste to give me a granddaughter, which was really good of them. And why are you seeing her? 1, you could use some good news because everything I gave you tonight was bad news. 2, every one of you have a person that looks just like that in your life. Every single one of you does. And what we're fighting is a federal government and lots of money and lots of power. But we are not the targets. That face is the target. So when you want to say this is too big and this is too hard and I want to quit and I want to give up, I want you to keep that face in your life right in front of you. They don't have anybody else to fight for them. They are the target of every single piece of the puzzle that I handed you tonight. And the only people standing between them and that firing line is each of you. You need to remember that. Because that face in your life is worth every single ounce of effort that you can bring to bear to protect them. And they are counting on you. They don't know it yet. But it isn't just their future. It's their souls that we are fighting to protect and preserve. And in preserving those, we will preserve the America that we love. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a question and answer session, and I believe we have someone that's going to be asking the question. And I'm going to come around with a basket to collect the rest of the questions.
For those of you in the room who don't know me, my name's Garrett Rhodes. I'm a 37-year resident of Lower McCountry Township, and myself, along with Mr. Chris Donatelli back here, recently got through the primary on the Republican side in the East Penn School District, so we're looking forward to being board members. I just want to thank you all for coming out here tonight, because I feel this is a very important issue facing our children for all the reasons that Dr. Luksic pointed out. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Number one, how does the success or failure of student performance affect teacher, superintendent, and principal salaries?
Remember the grant was 300 pages long, obviously we didn't do the whole 300. In the grant application, they actually talk about teachers are rewarded or punished based upon their performance against the standards. It's a acceptable yearly progress. AYP is what you will see in educational parlance. And everything is measured against the standards. So new teachers to be certified will have to learn this, and principals and districts and teachers will all be evaluated based upon how well their students perform the standards, which is why we needed the teacher identifier.
Even if we get Common Core out of Pennsylvania, don't we still have to work at getting the FERPA law changed?
Yes, that is a simple answer. Yes, actually, the law didn't change. The regulations under the law changed. The legislature passes a law, then it goes to whatever the right bureaucracy is, and that bureaucracy is actually who says, this is how we're going to make the law be implemented. That's what needs to change. The law, the FERPA law itself did not change. The legislature did not change the law. The Department of Education changed the regulations defining that law. That's what needs to change.
How does the rigor of the standards affect low socioeconomic or special education students?
Those are actually two different questions. Remember we talked about 93% graduation rate is what the grant application says. So you're in inner city Philadelphia and you're struggling. Are you going to go beyond Algebra 1? Probably not. If you're in, I don't know what the upper class school district here is. Outside of Philadelphia would be Bryn Mawr. Do y'all know where Bryn, Main Line, all those. They're not going to stop at Algebra 1 if those parents have to hire their own private tutors. So what you're going to have is two classes of students. Think about what students in the Bryn Mawr School District look like, and think about what students in the inner city Philadelphia school system look like. There's a very ugly word for this. Because you're going to have two classes of students coming out. Some who have the ability and some who are denied it from the very earliest age. They're leveled off. This is as far as you can go. Special ed students are a different, whole different category. Because unfortunately they will have to take these tests as a special ed teacher. You spend a whole year working with them and then you stick them in front of a standardized test where they have no business being. It is really, really heartbreaking to watch what happens in that situation. The other part of this is since who needs extra help is defined against who met the standards or didn't meet the standards, true special education students are going to get lost in the mix of a much broader definition. And so the pie will be divided in much more pieces, so each piece will be smaller. So it'll be very difficult on real kids who have real special needs. They're going to get lost in the shuffle, sadly.
How does Common Core affect school libraries?
In the first year or so, it won't. What will happen is, as your school library, like every year most school districts, I don't want to speak for yours, but the pattern in most school districts is the school board appropriates, I'm making a number up, $100 to buy new books every year. If the district, you have to be 70% informational and 30% literature, what you will see over time is that the texts, the books in the library will move to match the standard. So you will see, over time, you will see a loss of the literature books in the libraries. But it won't happen in one day. It will happen over the implementation over time as the libraries weed out books, and they will have to have the books to match Common Core, so they certainly won't be buying books that don't.
Why has it been so difficult to fight something that is unconstitutional?
The easy answer is that, unfortunately, in this country, so many people don't care. And they're more concerned about what can I get and what's in it for me, and than they are about preserving the original constitutional structure. So it's difficult because there's, at one level, a lack of caring, at another level, a lack of knowledge. I forget, 2 years ago, I think, a woman was running for the United States Senate in the state of Delaware, and she was Republican. She was debating her Democrat opponent, and separation of church and state came up, and she said, well, those words aren't in the Constitution. She was sitting in a law school, and they laughed at her. Actually, those words are not in the Constitution. But so there's a real lack of knowledge. People don't any longer even know what the Constitution says because the schools haven't been teaching it for a very long time. So we have whole generations that really don't know. That makes it easy to take away something that you don't know you have.
I'm not showing favoritism here. I just have two questions here that are closely related, so I'm going to combine them for time. There have been no lawsuits against schools because of students having IEPs that weren't followed or met. What does this mean for teachers? And along with that, if you have an IEP, do you still need to pass the Keystones to graduate?
There's no lawsuits because it's almost impossible for an individual person to sue a school district unless you're a millionaire, because they can just run the bill up and up and up. So you don't get lawsuits, and that's why. Will they have to pass the Keystones? I don't know yet. The regulation regarding that has not come to final form. The final regulations for this, the state board passed the standards. Then they had to go back and amend the Pennsylvania School Code to put the standards into the school code. It goes in Chapter 4 of the school code. They passed those in March. They finally finished the school code part in March, brought it in front of the Regulatory Review Commission that approves all regulations. And the state board said this won't cost any money, because 3.14 isn't any money. And the Regulatory Review Commission said, yes, it will cost money. Come back and give us a real number. And they turned them down. So that's where we are right now. Now, the governor issued a statement 2 weeks ago saying, well, we're not going to rush in front of the Regulatory Review Commission. We're going to take the summer and think about it. So no legislation is needed. Why did he say that? Because what they're most afraid of is legislation. Because the State House and the State Senate can say, stop this. You are not allowed. Stop it. So the governor doesn't really want legislation. So we're not going to finish going in front of the Review Commission. He didn't say we're going to stop implementation. He didn't say that. And they don't actually have to go in front of the Regulatory Review Commission. The governor can implement anyway and come back later in front of that commission once it's already in process. So it's kind of a political maneuvering. But because that's where we are, all of the special ed connections, which is a different part of the school code, have not yet been written. So I don't know what they're going to say because they don't exist yet. Or at least I haven't seen them. So I can't give you a real answer because we're not there yet.
Will private schools and private colleges be included in the data systems?
Yes. Private colleges, I'm not sure. Private schools, yes. If you take any kind of government money, you're part of the process. In order to be certified, a teacher has to comply. In order to be accredited, the school has to comply. So private schools get accredited just like anybody else. And all of the textbooks are moving to Common Core, so it's hard to work around it. The training session that I went to was at a private school. Now, I blew it up and then all the teachers jumped on board, so that poor presenter didn't have a very good day. But the fact was she was there. And they will, In private schools, teachers still have to be certified, and to be certified, they have to meet the state requirements. Right now, it's Act 48. Act 48 is in a 2-year abeyance. Act 48 said you had to have, I think it was 180 additional credits every 5 years. That's in abeyance. They pushed it back 2 years, and the reason they did that is they're moving it over to Common Core. So they will have to comply because they have to have certified teachers, but their teachers can only get certified if they comply with Common Core. So they've set up it's a backward circle that gets in the door anyway. And if you want a Pennsylvania diploma, you have to meet the Pennsylvania standards. And private schools give a Pennsylvania diploma. And the state has the right to say, this is what you have to do to get a diploma that has our state seal on it.
Why are parents and local school boards being shunted aside by big government so much? Why are parents so silent at these issues?
I honestly don't think most parents have any idea. I mean, I don't. When I'm now doing several of these a week, and what I hear from parents mostly is they have no idea what's happening. They have questions, concerns, but they don't know a lot about it because this kind of bypassed the general public. So people are just starting to find out about it. Your parents are kind of a stumbling block. You just kind of insist on teaching your children what you believe. And you kind of insist on making sure your kids learn as much as they can learn. And that's not really the plan here. So parents are sort of in the way. And so the goal is, if we can get around you, that would be great.
Is it true that even under current educational standards, some school administrators sometimes ask teachers to fudge grades up to improve graduation rates? And are students being taught to think or to pass tests?
The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, actually in April of this year, had an article, you can go back and find it, in which there is currently an ongoing investigation in Pennsylvania in which they have so far found more than 140 instances of cheating by either teachers or school administrators on the PSSA. So are they fudging? Well, yes, they are, and there's newspaper articles about it. Why? Because the tests are high stakes. Are we teaching to the test? Yes. And you kind of can't blame people if the school district funding is tied to it and teacher certification or promotion is tied to it, then of course you're going to teach to it. You would too. Remember, if your boss is at the door at 1 minute after 9, you're going to come in at 9 o'clock. We all do what we're held accountable to do in our job. That's how we behave. And so by the state making this test be high stakes, it drives curriculum. So anything that's not on the test gets eliminated. And in the month before the test, if you walked into pretty much any school in Pennsylvania, they're teaching to the test to try to get their kids to pass the test.
I think you addressed this during the presentation. How does Common Core affect homeschools?
We talked a little bit about the GED. Colleges are being told to change their entrance requirements, as you saw, to meet the Keystone exams. So you may be the one teaching, but you will be teaching your child this poison because everything will move to this. Additionally, the textbook companies, if you walk into, I forget where I was in the state, they walked into a store where they typically bought homeschool materials and they all had big stamps on them saying Common Core compliant because they want to stay in business. And so you're going to be affected because you won't be able to buy books that aren't. You will have to pass the Keystone exams in order to get into a college. So, because that's going to, the plan is for those to become the college entrance exams. And in this state, they're called Keystone. They're called something different in every state. But remember, identical across all the states. So it doesn't matter what they call them. Same standards, same tests. It doesn't matter where they came from. The door to get to the next level is Common Core. So it'll affect everybody.
I just want to remind the audience, these questions are from the audience and not mine. I'm a school board member. We only get 15% of our funding from the state and 1% from the federal government. Can we forego this funding and not have to comply?
You know, I really wish I could tell you the answer is yes, but it's no. Because in order to give a Pennsylvania diploma, you must comply with Pennsylvania standards. Now, I'm beginning to feel like if this is Tuesday, it must be Belgium. I was in someplace else in the state with a school board member. They're working on adopting a resolution as a school board saying we don't want to. It is legally meaningless. It is politically extremely effective because an entire school board says we won't. They can make you, they will make you. But it sends a message to state reps and state senators, so it's a good thing to do. It also sends a message to your parents and taxpayers that there's a problem that encourages them to get more involved. So it is a good thing to do to say no, even though you can't actually structurally stop it. Sometimes standing in opposition in the middle is a very good thing to do, and that's kind of the state of it right now.
And again, as a school board member, I want to bring this up at a meeting, but all that appears in the news are sound bites. What would you recommend to bring this forward?
I think I would talk about the standards aligned system, because most people do not know that it's there. That's the computerized, remember that's where the curriculum is on the computer. I would ask for a full demonstration of that at a school board meeting. And I would say, since Pennsylvania law requires that every parent have access to all curriculum materials, what are we as a school board doing to make sure that every parent in our district is fully aware of this and has full access to it? You'll blow a bunch of things up.
I think the answer to this one is self-evident. What happens when the child's problem is the family environment?
Do you remember the districts had to say additional services? Remember, everything is based on hitting the standards. So, and the data system tracks kids by demographics. So we know, family background, socioeconomic, health information. So if the family is the problem, then we need more intervention to fix it. Which is not really good news, but that's the way the system works.
Now, these two, again, are similarly correlated. What is the connection between Common Core and the UN's Agenda 21? And the next one is, this sounds like UN Agenda 21. Are you familiar with it?
Yes, I'm familiar with it. This is a way to implement that. The Sustainability Summit, do you all know what Agenda 21 is? That's all about the sustainability movement. So that was what the Secretary was talking about in his speech. We haven't had a lot of success with this, so if we push it into the schools, we'll teach a whole generation and then we'll be able to move that agenda forward.
This one's unique. With a show of hands, how many people present tonight voted in the last two primaries and the 2012 presidential election? Excellent. Glad to see it. Congratulate yourselves. Because our turnout in my township was 11%. 11. We were looking at historical lows and we had nice weather. I was in it all day. I know you were too, Brian. How will Common Core affect admissions to college? And also, overall, is the Common Core going to affect elementary school standards?
Yes. The Common Core standards start in kindergarten, and they work their way all the way up through all the grades. They're specific. I just printed them out last night. There's just in one section, there was like 70 pages of them, single-spaced in columns. So they affect every level of education, and that was just the English standards. So they affect everything that happens. They are very specific. A lot of them are sort of mumbo-jumbo-y. They're like, what? It's silly to read. But there's an actual agenda, and it affects everything from the day you enter the classroom until the day you end. And the colleges if the college gets money, how can the state make the college change? Anybody that's in like the Pennsylvania state system of higher education, Penn State, Pitt, University of Pennsylvania, they all get state money. So they have to comply because, the golden rule, the moment the goal makes the rules. So if the Keystone exams are tied to Common Core and the colleges are being told the Keystone exams are your entrance exams, we've got a seamless web. And what will happen is you won't see that they can't do it. that your kids aren't performing until it's too late. And they never college and career ready. So you can go to the service industry, you can go. There's nothing wrong with any of those jobs. You know, I have 6 children, they didn't all go to college. I have a daughter who's a classical ballerina, so she was a professional dancer at 17. Well, she's now a principal dancer and a master teacher. College wasn't the right path for her. So she took a different road. But I determined that. With her and her dance teachers, and the government didn't. College isn't the right place for everybody. But it's not the government's job to decide who goes and who doesn't. It's your job.
This next one, I believe, was already answered, is how does this affect private and religious schools? So we'll move on to the next one. Who is behind the Council of Chief State School Offices and the National Governors Association? In other words, who decided that we needed these organizations? What is the alternative? Homeschooling without a charter school?
The National Governors Association, in its original form, was just all the governors came together, you know, kind of like your township supervisors come together to talk to the state as a body. The governors could come together to share notes on what was happening in the various states. It has grown into kind of a trade association that has now a different agenda. The Council of Chief State School Officers, in Pennsylvania, that's our Secretary of Education. It would be whoever is the Chief Education Officer in each state. And they receive money from a variety of sources. When you have a group like that, governors are very busy people, so you wind up with a kind of a bureaucratic staff that can kind of drive the show. And that's what's happening in these organizations, is that you have an internal bureaucracy that drives the agenda. And the governors pay some attention and don't, depending, because they're busy. They're running their states. So it's not like they're sitting down together. The governors, maybe they come once a year. It's really an organization that now has a life and an agenda of its own. And what has happened over the years is that they've become funded by groups like the Gates or GE or AT&T or Carnegie or Rockefeller, and there's a list. They also they get money from the federal government to market and promote federal agendas. But then it looks like it's coming from the state because it's moving through a trade association. So they kind of morphed over the years. They didn't start as something nefarious or underhanded or conspiratorial. They've just kind of become captured by a bureaucracy. And in government at this point, bureaucracy is really, unfortunately, in many areas, the driving force behind what's happening. Unless the legislators actually stand up and take control, a lot of things happen without them.
This card had many questions on it. Almost all of them have been answered except this one. What is the Teacher Incentive Fund?
It was designed extra money for teachers to teach in districts that people don't want to teach in. Whether it's, inner city districts where there's a high violence area, districts that have a high, low, have a larger percentage of low socioeconomic, so it's more of a challenge to teach. The incentive fund was basically signing bonuses if you would go and teach in those areas.
We're getting near the end here. How do we best contrast what is now being implemented to what will be soon, so as to effectively alarm our school boards and inform them?
I think I would use Algebra 1. Do you want the high school graduation standard here to be Algebra 1? Because that's the most, it's the most easily explainable, egregious mess in this system. And that's something that you want them to start looking at what's happening. You can also start talking about some of the political agendas that are being implemented, and they're not hard to find. So, those are the kind of things that specific examples that impact children in our district are always the best way to start a conversation.
Two more. some really good ones in here too. This is all the same questions. We'll do this one and this one. Why are teachers' unions silent on the issue of Common Core?
Actually, they're not. In the beginning, when the stabilization fund happened, because remember that was money to keep education funding and it was supposed to keep teachers in their jobs, so the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers signed off on it. But I was talking to a state representative who said to me, he called me and said, I need more information because the most conservative member of my district and the teachers union are both opposed to this. And when those two people want the same thing, I should pay attention. So they're not. Their opposition is probably different than yours. What the teachers unions are beginning to say is, why are you implementing the standards and the testing before there's any curriculum? Like, you're holding us accountable to teach something and giving us no curriculum to teach it with. So it's a backwards system. But the teachers unions in New York State, there's actually headlines that the teachers unions are very active in their opposition. And here in Pennsylvania, you have teacher union representatives talking to state reps and state senators. In the Senate Education Committee hearing, Senator Dinniman, who was the minority chair, said he had been contacted by the teachers unions and they were opposed to it. So they're not silent. They originally signed on because it was money, and now they're beginning to look, wait, this isn't quite what we had in mind. So now whether that will last or not, I don't know, but that's where we are right now.
You actually were able to answer one of the questions we weren't going to get to with that. They wanted to know about, are the legislators educated on the issue? And I think the best way you can do that is to contact them directly. Believe it or not, they will listen to you. They want to hear from you, so do that. So we'll get to the last set of questions. What are the chances that Common Core will be fully implemented in Pennsylvania? Do we have a chance to stop this, and how do we do it? How can Common Core be stopped? So what can we do about it?
This fall, Common Core will start being implemented in the state of Pennsylvania because there's no way to stop it in 60 days. Does that mean you can never stop it? No. In the 1990s, we talked a little bit about outcome-based education. That was this government's attempt then to do what they're doing now. And when a number of us got involved, we were right about where we are right now. I became one of the leading national opponents. I debated it in every state except Hawaii. I was even in Alaska. It took 5 years and we beat them. In politics, the issue only dies if you go away. As long as you're willing to stick with it, as long as you're willing to fight for it, this can be beaten. Now what will happen is reality is going to help you. Because as it begins to be implemented, people who knew nothing are going to start saying, what? What? I was at one meeting and a gentleman said that it was like a first grader who could write her name but was told the teacher always did it because everybody can't write their name. So we don't want them to feel bad, so you're not allowed to. That's Common Core. Level. Everybody has to be level all the time. Level. So what you will see in that case, as the leveling begins to happen, you're going to see people beginning to scream. And that always helps. You know, when somebody's trying to implement something that's ridiculous, it surfaces that it's ridiculous. And as it moves through, when people see their kids not doing the math they're supposed to do, and not reading literature, and getting the kind of propaganda that we looked at tonight, more and more people will stand up. You just need to be there to give information. You need to talk to your state reps. You need to talk to your state senators. Be very factual. Don't say it's purple if it's pink. Don't exaggerate. Don't draw conclusions. Give actual information, which is why the presentation is available on the website, so you can pull those pages off and walk in with them. That makes a difference. Divide yourselves up. Don't have one meeting with 10 people, have 5 meetings with 2 people each, because then they heard it 5 times. A number of years ago, I was working on an issue in the State House, and when it came to a vote on the floor, one state rep stood up and said, I don't agree with her, but give her what she wants, because my office is doing nothing but answering phone calls on this issue. You can do the right thing for the reason of your choice. It doesn't matter. So in politics, and that's what this is, in politics, if the citizens really want it, You can achieve it. You just have to keep working at it. Can you stop it before August? No. Does that mean it can't be stopped? No. It just means it'll take a little longer. So in the interim, you have to protect your own kids. You have to make sure your children are not guinea pigs in this system. You have to do everything you can to make your kids get as much of the education they're supposed to get that you can. And if you're a teacher in the system, as long as you can, fight it out. Close your door, do the right thing. Fight for the kids that are in front of you if you're a teacher in the system. So it's kind of like wherever you are, fight the battle there. Aid everything at the State House and the State Senate and the governor's office. The governor has a hotline. Call it, and 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 call it. Because that's how you move a politician. He is walking into a re-election year. He is walking into a re-election year from a position of weakness, not strength. He does not want those who he perceives to be his base to be dissatisfied with him. If you were a donor to his campaign, make sure you say so when you call. If you know a donor to his campaign, have that person call. Because money talks in politics. So think about how the process works and then use it. This can be beaten. It won't be beaten by August, but it can be beaten. I know, I beat it once before. It took a long time. It takes a lot of work, but it is definitely possible. And those people need us to win. So I'm going to. You can come.
Being interested in this issue. If you're interested in other sources or information on future Common Core events, please sign the clipboard as you leave tonight, and please consider a donation in the basket as you're leaving the lobby. We thank Hope Community Church for their generosity in using their facility. Thank you. And have a safe drive home.